Welcome to Advancing Cyber, where we explore the critical cybersecurity issues shaping today's geopolitical and business landscapes. Each episode brings together leaders from cyber law, policy, and technology to offer insights that cut through the complexity of the digital age. I'm Cristin Flynn Goodwin, a cybersecurity law and incident response expert. But I got my start way back when in telecom and IR, and we're going to leverage that in today's conversation. Today, we're bringing together telecommunications and the internet. We're going to talk about the long-standing Telecommunications Service Priority program, which acts like an insurance policy, restoring services or setting up new ones when disasters strike and infrastructure needs to be rebuilt or set up for responders, as is being used all over the South in the wake of recent hurricanes. In this episode, we'll explore how and whether TSP should be applied to the cloud and cloud infrastructure. And we're going to talk to people who have lived and worked with this program for a long time, and I'm really excited about that. Kathryn Condello is a leader with Lumen and within the telecommunications sector, with more than 30 years experience in national security, network reliability, and emergency preparedness programs, planning, and policy initiatives. Kathryn represents Lumen at the federal level in all policy planning and operational issues related to national security, emergency preparedness, disaster response, cybersecurity, critical infrastructure preparedness, and continuity of operations. She's currently an adjunct professor with the University of New Hampshire, MS program in cybersecurity policy and risk management. I think it's also pretty cool that Kathryn started her career in the public safety radio business and was a commercial wireless pioneer with more than 20 years experience prior to joining Lumen. Our second guest and our technical expert today is Marcus Sachs, who I've also known for a very long time. Mark is an internationally recognized senior executive with over 40 years professional experience in national, homeland, and cybersecurity. He has deep technical experience in secure operations of large data networks and response to high-profile security incidents. Mark is currently the Senior Vice President and Chief Engineer at the Center for Internet Security. He's a former White House National Security Council presidential appointee and was the first Department of Homeland Security cybersecurity mission area leader. His past roles include Vice President for National Security Policy at Verizon, Senior Vice President and Chief Security Officer at the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, which we all know and love as NERC, and the Deputy Director for Research at Auburn University's McCrary Institute for Cyber and Critical Infrastructure Security. All of that came after a distinguished 20-year military career. Mark is also a prolific volunteer in the cybersecurity community, where he lives in Huntsville, Alabama, and in initiatives across the United States. As with past episodes, any legal opinions you hear do not constitute legal advice. Let's start advancing cyber. Okay, so telecommunications service priority. This is a little bit of a complicated topic, and we have to jump into the Wayback Machine to talk about national security and emergency preparedness communications in the United States. AT&T was broken up in August of '82, and until then, we had one system, one way of working. So when the government was concerned about maintaining national security and emergency preparedness, or as you'll hear us talking about it today, NSEP services, and that included things like 911 services or police or military, or really critical things like national security, like the phone lines in the White House. The TSP program was created in 1988 to help manage making sure that those critical services were always available after the breakup of AT&T. What it did was really terrific. It acts like an insurance policy of sorts. If you are in the TSP program before disaster or crisis strikes, then you can either have your services restored first or new services built before others can. But if you're not in the program, you're out of luck. It's just like insurance. You can't buy it after the disaster happens. So the four main pillars of TSP are national security leadership, national security posture, and U.S. population attack warning, public health, safety, and maintenance of law and order for public welfare and maintenance of national economic posture. And we're going to come back to these throughout the conversation, in particular that maintenance of national economic posture, as we talk about whether TSP can work for the cloud. So when a crisis hits, TSP really takes these questions away. So let's turn to Mark and to Kathryn and open up this discussion. Am I crazy to think that TSP, a program designed for telecommunications, has a role for cloud services?
Since I am the current telecom provider, in my opinion, they do. I think one of the things that we are constantly striving with is, and I think some of the work at CISA has been very helpful, is trying to get a sense of what are the critical functions upon which national security or economic security ride. So when something goes down, or something's broken, hurricane, tornado, fire, if you know that to get things up running quickly, if you do these 10 things, you have a better foundation for a quicker outcome, that's important to know. Everybody sort of understands their reliance on telecom. I think everybody sort of understands their reliance on energy. But beyond that, it's a blank. So these ideas are being teased out across many sectors, not just cloud. And in my mind, given the incredibly predominant role that the cloud providers currently exhibit to support economic functioning, no surprise that they would be considering it as well.
Yeah, the cloud brings in the services aspect. So we can do everything in the world in cybersecurity in terms of patching systems and do everything in the world of physical security, which is where TSP works out well to make sure the circuits are physically there, that people can communicate. So we can move data if we restore these things, but the meaning of the data oftentimes is overlooked. Just because I have circuits, just because I can have computers talk to each other, if I can't pull meaning out, if I can't make the email work, or I can't make the website work, or I can't do a transaction, a financial transaction, so what if we've got everything else working? Those services in the last 10, 15 years have largely moved over to your big cloud providers. Previously, businesses did that themselves. So if I had circuits up and running to my own data centers, then a bank customer, for example, if they needed to do online banking, they're dealing directly with the bank. This is frequently being moved over to these public cloud providers. It's cheaper, it's more efficient to do that. Others, the hospitals, for example, largely moving to cloud-based services now for healthcare. We see it with energy providers, even utilities, water, wastewater treatment, others largely moving over to cloud service providers because it's cheaper and certainly can be more secure. But if I can't make the service work because the cloud world isn't working, even if the circuits are up, you can just hold that priorities in place, then it doesn't do me any good. And so this is where, as Kathryn's pointing out, we've got to look at the cloud now as a new emerging area. It's got to have some priority attached to it. And if we look back over the last 20, 25 years as we were developing critical infrastructure, those words, we began a strong focus largely on the physical world, but also including some of the virtual world. The cloud has emerged since then. The word was around, but its popularity has come about since those early discussions about what is deemed to be critical. And maybe now is the time for that conversation. Are certain cloud services just as critical as a gas line or a power line or an airport or other things in the physical world we deem critical? Should we now deem a cloud service as critical? And then it could get priority of restoration. It could fall into the same sort of mindset of if a disaster happens, how do we restore this with some sort of priority so key services are back up and running for key customers?
I think contrarians would argue, isn't the point of the cloud that you can route data away from the failure of one data center into others, right? That's the whole dynamic nature of the cloud. And while I think that's right, to me, what's attractive about this concept of having a TSP-like system for cloud services is the nation state attack scenario, where you get a nation state that's willing to go after some aspect of the supply chain of data centers, not just one provider, but a whole bunch. And then you've got a major restoration issue for data center providers in the United States. How do you decide who comes back online first? At the moment, who would do that in the United States?
In the communications sector, I think it was a 10-year process to be able to develop the current telecommunications service priority. And the good news is that it already reflects sort of the continuum between national security concerns, nuclear command and control, down to sort of the emergency preparedness and how do you save the population, if you will. candidly, I would not wish that to be revisited. It would take another 10 years. Okay, so let's just assume for the moment, we'll share the fantasy that this is a good sort of like way to view it globally. I think the key question is that as an operator, as a network service provider, we only use the TSP as a guideline. I mean, it's not like we're only fixing one thing at a time. But as you're looking at the plethora of things that might have happened, you have to be aware of what's going on, who's running on this, who might be more impacted than most, and to make your sort of priorities and to have that sort of mind sense of there's a lot of circuits I didn't know that they belong to, I don't know, DOD or to belong to the Department. I didn't know, they obfuscate, the type, but you've got this code and they go, okay, for whatever reason, this is really important. I think that particularly in a cloud space where I'm not particularly concerned about you being able to swap over from your European to your US to your APAC. I'm not concerned about that. I think you guys have that kind of locked down. But if you're in a scenario where a nation state has said, for instance, you use two major VMware kind of providers, and one of them has just been hosed, well, you have less stuff to be able to process and to handle within your, let's say, 3 separate cloud center instantiations. I think that this is a scenario where by understanding sort of who's behind the customers and what you prioritize and what's standing and what you prioritize in terms of how you bring things up. From my perspective, intellectually, I think that would be valuable. I'm not speaking for the cloud people, but I think that would be valuable.
I think there's a lot of value also in a cloud provider knowing if I have to prioritize, here's the list I work from. That has it already been done out ahead of time. So in incident handling, we often talk about preparation as being the most important. That's the first step and the most important step. So this means that any emergency service provider or any other critical infrastructure provider, if they're going to use a cloud service, then the fact that they're there, the fact that they would need to have some prioritization, if that's established ahead of time in the preparatory phase, then figuring out who gets the priority, and we can leave that, as Kathryn says, I'd hate to have that job. We'll leave that up to some government agency to figure out. But at least we've already established ahead of time the need to have a certain service with some priority on it. As you dig into, say, a municipal utility, and I love looking at clean water, wastewater, because everybody has it. Everybody's got water coming into their home, their businesses, and so forth. Historically, that's all been isolated. It's relevant at a very local level. But in the last 5 to 10 years, many vendors are pushing to get the actual operational technology or the industrial control systems that are inside those water pumps and wastewater stations to have them managed through a cloud service. So you don't have to send a technician physically on site. I can remotely update, patch, monitor, control, bill, what to fill in the blank for what you're doing. But if that cloud service goes down and it's far, far away from the municipal utility, and we saw this as a kind of an adjacent problem with Colonial Pipeline, where they had an IT problem, but it caused them to no longer be able to move fuel through their pipelines. Imagine that happening at a water system. So should they have priorities through that cloud service provider to have the water turned on? Well, everybody would say, of course. But the cloud provider just kind of goes to what Kathryn just said. Here's a bundle of circuits. I didn't know these were all DoD. I mean, it's just copper or fiber optic or whatever you physically look at it. You can't. It's not like there's a special color for Defense Department. How do I know that this allocation, this set of CPUs inside of a cloud instance belongs to a water supply system in Denver, Colorado? I wouldn't know. And does that get restoration priority over, say, a website service being run for Walmart or Target? These are great questions. And because it's all co-located and it's shared infrastructure. And yes, there is resiliency built in, but we're thinking worst case, so that if the natural resiliency isn't working, then what? And we hope we never get that far, that we've got enough resiliency built in. This is something the cloud is really, really good at. It's being able to diversity and move things around. And it's agile. Yeah, it actually works, right? For worst case, then what? Who gets the priority of turning things back on or restoring services to who is the priority customer?
Well, it raises a really interesting point, because in the cloud world, you can know who are the services that need it. I mean, intuitively know wastewater, hospitals, police departments. But when your largest customer then comes, screaming into the CEO saying, I don't care what it costs, get me back online, those customers can also move to the front of the line. So it's an interesting balancing act. And Kathryn, to your point, network service providers understand today how to balance those priorities. I think it's a really interesting point that as we see more and more aggressive nation state actors and we think about cloud restoration and threats, we don't have a system in place. It's a really interesting thought when you apply the 4 pillars: national security leadership, national security posture, and U.S. population attack warning, public health, safety, and maintenance of law and order, public welfare, and maintenance of national economic posture. Like that last bucket, that's really the critical infrastructure bucket. How do you see that applying in the cloud service space where there's such a diversity of customer? You've got just in the IT sector alone, everything from really critical IT services to online gaming, which my kids argue is critical infrastructure. But do we need to be thinking, because of sort of the maturity of where we are in the conversation, of even more fidelity around priority from what we had maybe 20 years ago?
Well, and Cristin, is there maybe even a 5th bucket, and that's our foreign partners, other countries? Other countries that deliberately are using U.S.-based infrastructure because of its resiliency. There are a number of small countries that do that. It's on purpose because they know they can't get that resiliency within their boundaries of their country, so they depend on us. Is that a 5th bucket that needs to be addressed somewhere? That we also recognize the dependency on what we're doing to keep somebody else sovereign and economically viable and provide their own national security. We've got to have that conversation too, right?
Certainly, it is a worthy conversation, particularly given the nature of the cloud ecosystem. I find myself thinking, however, that, ultimately, and just as it is with the telecom providers, I don't decide if those cluster of 12 circuits are TSP worthy or not. The end user has to. And I think that there's sort of a coming together of sort of the understanding that there are national critical functions that the nation relies upon. 56 of them, I think there are. Plus, there's sort of that concept of systemically important entities, okay? So the key in my mind is going to be that, one, we're going to share the fantasy that we're going to be using these same sort of, protocols, and we're going to postpone the international thing because, oh my God, that's a 15-year discussion. The point is that the end user needs to be sufficiently articulate to be able to say, it's just not DoD who gets systems that are, critical. No, it's the most important things. The end user has to be articulate enough to understand that of his 10,000 circuits and IP addresses for some major bank, these are the ones upon which really, really are the critical functions for that major institution. Not only that, but they also have to be able to explain, if this goes down, what would be the impact? Now, in circuit land, that's fairly simple. And for instance, we have TSP on no DoD or federal cafeteria circuits. We just don't do it, okay? But we do have a lot of TSP circuits for federal agencies and state agencies and hospitals and stuff. So it's not the whole thing, it's a portion of the thing. And to that end, in essence, an end user of a cloud provider would be able to say, by the way, you are my backup for everything I've got in X. I support 10,000 customers. I provide water to this. You would have to be able to state your own recognition that you are critical to this aspect. And I think that if this would get expanded to the cloud environment, I do believe that a lot of the work that's been done in terms of being able to assess national critical functions and systemically important entities within the nation would come to bear and be able to articulate why they should get prioritization in a cloud space.
You just build on what's already there. You already have TSP, you already have WPS, the wireless priority service. If those things are already in place for Organization X, we start with them. As an organization, they're at the front of the line for figuring out priorities. But I think, Kathryn, the awkward part, you're nailing it here, is that as a service provider, I don't know what's important to you. I can take an educated guess, but the asset owner, has to be the one that says, this is truly my priority. And in this sense, specifically what within AWS or within Google Cloud or whoever's the service, exactly what is it inside that cloud that is important to me and in this priority order? So until you can articulate that, until an asset owner can articulate that, I mean, this is a great, like you say, Kathryn, a great fantasy conversation, but it is a conversation we need to start having. It's no different than with TSP. I'm sure they were talking about it in the 60s and 70s before it was finally realized in the 80s. Same thing with WPS. We went through a long period there where there was no such thing, but it was the post 9/11, I think Salt Lake City Olympics was kind of the driver for getting WPS working because we realized we had to have something like that. So we've had many cases now, and maybe that would be helpful, Cristin, would be to identify, have there been failures in the cloud services that but for a TSP kind of priority, we've had damage. I don't know of anybody being killed because of a cloud downtime, but there may have been lost revenue or some
Economic impact, yep.
Right. I think that would be maybe our homework assignment, but see if we can find some cases we could build on. And that might help us in this journey of determining what would be a critical cloud service for these organizations that have already been deemed to be critical and are already qualifying for TSP and WPS and others.
Well, it's a really interesting point that Kathryn's making and you've made about circuits, because there are ways to think about corollaries in the cloud space, and that's tenants. Every customer has a tenant in their Amazon or Google or Azure instance, and many cloud customers have hundreds of tenants, if not thousands. And so that's where it is a really interesting business continuity and disaster response exercise for companies that are using cloud services to even identify, of the tenants that they have, which are the truly essential ones.
That's the point. You don't have to figure it out.
That's right.
Tenants need to come to whoever and say, look, this is a critical function I have sitting in this cloud environment. And, if really bad things happen, I want to know that I might not be first in line, but I'm going to be fairly fast in line to be addressed, because the service what I'm using the cloud service for is critical to the nation. So you, cloud provider, don't need to figure that out. Instead, a program needs to be set up so that people who do rely on the cloud for their most critical stuff know that they can find a way to sort of get certified, to get the priority, to get the code, whatever, so that they know that they have a higher level of assurance that even if things go completely horrible, that they're in some of the earlier lines to get restored.
Sitting here listening to this now thinking, what about the opposite? Does AWS use TSP?
Cloud providers do, but they are using them for the connectivity between, let's say, a cloud service provider or a data center to other things. So they are using it to protect the transport. Okay.
Well, that's what I wanted to make sure we're clear on. As long as we're not overlooking the obvious here, just because somebody has a priority on cloud services, does that cloud provider, and there's the big three, but there's many more beyond the big three.
There are.
Because they have that restoration of their own statistics. And Kathryn is saying yes. So at least we've covered that base early. That's not glaring omission in this conversation.
And Marcus, only because we've worked together for a while, you might know as well that, if a customer comes to us and says, look, these circuits are really important and I've got a code from DHS, and we go, really? Let's have a chat. This opens up the opportunity to say, if this is really important enough for you to get a TSP code for, do we need to talk further about other non-restoration mechanisms that we can do to better assure your service? I anticipate that any of the cloud tenants came to the cloud provider and said, by the way, I'm a TSP level 3 on these services. The cloud provider would go, really? Well, let's talk about what else we can do between us to make sure that you never need to invoke that level 3, if you will. I know that over the course of decades, some of our most sophisticated customers came to us initially with, I would like a TSP code, and we told them how to do it, and then they come back to us and they go, now that we've got you here, and yay for you getting a TSP code, let's have a deeper conversation about what we can do to make sure that you never need to invoke that. And I think that's a very healthy, rigorous kind of conversation that ends up making everybody more resilient.
Right. And coming from a telecom, a classic telco who thoroughly understands NSCP, thoroughly understands resiliency, all the terms we've used over the years, to now sit in an education role to help a customer understand these are the things you can do as a customer to build your own resiliency so you don't have to make the call, hey, I need priority. Because I've already worked through some of these things. Emerging infrastructure owners, that are laying their own fiber across the fruited plain that are not your classic telcos. Do they need to be included in this conversation, and particularly if it's private fiber? And what role do they play in restoration? Because this really is a restoration conversation.
Well, the private fiber has TSP on our fiber, and we are their backup.
Yeah, there we go. Circular conversation.
I like where Kathryn's going, because what it's encouraging is a much more holistic conversation about the overall security of the customer's needs. And frankly, that's what was driving this original thought from a cloud security perspective, is there is a holistic need for security, because in the event that you have a major cloud incident that is disruptive to the ecosystem here in the US, we don't have a systematic way to help ensure restoration across multiple cloud services. And that's going to be hugely disruptive. Telecom's done a great job working out the kinks in the system and the rules of the road, right? So we have a regulatory approach, and the FCC has been the long-standing regulator. And now that we have CISA, we've been doing this long enough to remember the time before DHS was involved, right? But, now we have DHS involved as the administrator of the program. Would that be the right pairing if we were to extend this to apply to the cloud? Would the FCC still be the right regulator?
I think, no, Kathryn's probably in the line here. The FCC needs to stay in their lane with telecommunications, what they've done well. I don't know that CISA is mature enough yet to serve as a good regulator for the ones and zeros and the services, websites, databases, blah, blah, blah. It took a while for the FCC to get its sea legs, from its creation back in the 30s, when it was mainly about frequencies, radio, and then emerging television frequency management. To get into content, that took another 30 or more years before they evolved to that point.
88 when the TSP program, so that was 50 years. Okay, then.
Years, yeah.
On the other hand, I can think of no one better than CISA. They do have the National Risk Management Center, which is supposed to understand, although this is such nascent research, that even though they've got more experience than anybody, it's still not a body of knowledge yet. I'm being academic. I do think they have insights, however, into the ability to articulate, if I am a dam, lock, or levee that happens to use the cloud, and I support X number of people, geographies, states, they're in a better position to understand the consequences of if that cloud service was taken down, and the optimal nature of whether or not that particular end user, tenant, as they say in cloud space, should be prioritized. And I think it's the work that they've done through the National Risk Management Center that at least provides a foundation for looking at that. And it is multi-sector, all across all of them, not just, telecom or whatever. So I think that if there's any place with a body of knowledge that's not DOD, okay, I think that that's still the most likely place for it to hang.
Would that be more effective to keep them as the administrator? Would we treat this as an emergency response issue and give the regulation itself to FEMA? Or do you take it in a different direction?
The problem you're going to run into, CISA becomes a regulator, is what they're trying to regulate is not domestic. And this is an international thing. And I don't know that any other country wants a U.S. agency being their regulator. So it becomes very awkward because, as you know, cyberspace doesn't understand domestic boundaries. That's an artificial thing that we have in place. Circuit's a little easier because you have physical buildings and ground stations. The model we used over at NERC is probably one worth looking at, where you have a federal regulatory agency, that's FERC, that handles mostly the economic side. So it's a level playing field for buying and selling energy. But NERC is a nonprofit that regulates Canada, US, Mexico electric grid. So you have 3 countries that have agreed to let a nonprofit be their regulator. The companies that are regulated have developed a set of best practices that they all agree to. So maybe a way forward is your major cloud providers worldwide would form a nonprofit that becomes their quote-unquote regulator. Enforcement's done at the country level, but the actual regulator is a nonprofit, a non-governmental organization, an NGO, because of the global nature of the cloud. And that way you don't wind up with any one particular agency trying to exert regulatory authority over a business in another country just because a U.S. critical provider is using a cloud service that's headquartered out of Germany, or I'm just making up an example. And you see where I'm going over Canada, for that matter, because they're right next door.
And I'm not sure that the big R, regulation, even needs to come into this. In the case of telecom, it had to, because we are a common carrier and we're supposed to provide common access for common price for what under any circumstances. So because it's definitely a best efforts kind of scenario. But we were already regulated, so therefore it had to be done by the regulator to sort of balance the common carrier sort of law, if you will. In this sort of environment, if the need is articulated, and if the major cloud providers say this would be of value, then I think that creating the framework for how they're going to approach it, a consistent framework, thank you very much, would end up being a wonderful opportunity for the U.S. to take a lead on, does this have value? Would this be helpful? Do the end users, do the tenants want this sort of thing? And if the U.S. does take the lead on this, not even trying to take care of the other countries, but to say that for the U.S., this is how the big cloud providers are going to handle this, I think it would start to set a norm. And I think that you would find, I believe internationally, you would find great interest. And again, certainly in the cloud space, we could take the lead on sort of thinking about the hard, intractable problems, taking a position, starting to work it out, and refine as we go along.
If we don't do that, then it's kind of like with the ECPA, where the Europeans got way out in front on privacy. We definitely have been behind on that. But on the other hand, here in the U.S., we just use the European privacy laws because it's too hard to try and do it by 2 different standards. So if we came up with something, as Kathryn's saying, that is showing leadership, other countries would just adapt to it because it's too hard to have 2 systems. Yeah. If we don't do anything, then the Europeans certainly will, because they have that mindset with the EU to try and get out in front of these things. So we would need to be at the table and make sure that what we're looking for is represented. Otherwise, we'll wind up with somebody else's approach, and then we'll have to adapt that to the way we think here in the U.S.
Yeah. The hard part of a challenge like that is, of course, if you've got a multi-jurisdictional incident, which is much more likely in Europe than it is here, how do you deal with which countries' critical infrastructures get restored first? For a country the size of the United States, that's much less of an issue if you're dealing with the geographic and resource challenges between, let's say, France and its much smaller neighbor, Luxembourg. You can see where that would be a much harder conversation. How would you think about an international standard like that, where you're talking about flows of essentially humans to go help restore services?
In that use case, Luxembourg may or may not have data centers that are part of global cloud providers. Germany and France certainly would, just due to their size. So if Germany had a problem and Luxembourg depended on Germany, would France step up to help taking over in the virtual sensitive restoration? You're right. That is a great question when you have a lot of countries packed together. But over here in the U.S., we have states. And granted, we're a federated government, but we still do have states with state regulations and state laws and things that do vary a little bit from location to location. But all businesses generally do business in all 50 states on a level playing field. But the data centers are not necessarily physically where you are, unless it's all part of the cloud, right? Yep. And so you might run into restoration issues if a data center is in one state, but its big user is in the next state down. These are all great discussion questions. That's why I'm glad you're bringing this up, Cristin, because we're uncovering some thought ideas here that perhaps do need to be gelled out a bit, do need to have some debate and discussion as to pros and cons of different approaches.
If you do use the U.S. as sort of the leading point, we're going to try it here, we're going to test it here. You have tenants or customers that have gotten some form of, yes, you are more important and therefore you will be prioritized in case half of the equipment in all these cloud instantiations bugs out. I think the bigger trick will be this. If you're practicing this in the U.S., but you haven't, extended it to other countries, then the cloud providers who are going to have to sort of develop this framework are going to have to be able to articulate if something really bad happens in the first year of practice and Europe, Asia, Africa, South America are implicated, what will be the protocol under those sort of circumstances? Ultimately, it comes down to who are the end user tenants, not the cloud providers that need to do what they can do to prioritize the services that are running off those environments. So there'll be a bridging piece that you'll have to do to handle the international scenario, at least as a talking point, while you practice this whole thing in the US pilot.
This also assumes, I'll just pick on AWS and Azure. If they're big into AWS and AWS goes down hard, how quickly could they move to Azure? And right now that's not that easy. Whereas if I'm on AT&T and AT&T goes down, moving to Verizon is fairly straightforward because the devices that are it's not an easy thing to do, but it's easier than if I had to switch cloud providers in midstream. That's also part of this resiliency discussion we have to have is how hard is it if you have to move quickly to another provider? That's part of your plan. If something bad happens, particularly if the cloud provider looks like they're not going to come up, if it may be a few days because they really went down hard. I don't know that that's an easy thing technically to do right now because of the competitive nature of the way these cloud instances are set up, but it is something we need to also factor in.
I do know the financial services folks who are huge users of cloud have been contemplating that, and they too are sort of thinking about how does one develop an environment for a bank and whatever, where you have diversity in cloud providers just to prevent that. Once again, that ends up being a conversation where the most important things are sort of handled for that kind of, I'm going to call it cloud interoperability or transferability. It can't be done for the entire operation because it's difficult, it's tough, but those are some of the concepts that they're starting to think about. So once again, if you're prioritized, it requires a deeper conversation, and how it turns out for a bank versus a dam or a lock or a retail facility is going to be different for each one of those scenarios.
But to your point, Mark, about resiliency and international, I think the model to look at is Ukraine, because when they were invaded, they had laws in place that said that critical data had to stay domestic. And then all of a sudden you saw the government shift all of their critical domestic data into cloud services outside of their borders, right? Like it became the absolute inverse. And so if you were to think about from a national security and emergency preparedness perspective in the United States as a part of its national resiliency plan for cloud services, how would we do that? And could you have a way to prioritize where and how you would shift your cloud services outside of the U.S.?
And that goes into that very first step of preparation. And let's just use DoD as an example. Do they have agreements? Take the Five Eyes. That's the smallest of the alliances of the one that we're probably best connected with. UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and us. Is there an agreement between those five? So if the U.S. has problems, Canada could kick right in and help the DoD. Or if Australia has a problem, could New Zealand kick right in, et cetera. I'm sure Ukraine moved most of their stuff over here because they knew we were trustworthy and could provide better protection than, say, moving it to Poland, which would be their adjacent neighbor. These would have been interesting conversations to sit on as to how do they weigh the options as to what country do you move it to if you're going to move it out of your own. We're talking defense stuff, Ministry of Defense or Department of Defense. I I'm not in those conversations here in the U.S. I hope that they are having them, but you would probably start with your Five Eyes because those would get your closest alliances and then build out from there.
Well, for cloud services to move into priorities and prioritization, it will, to Kathryn's point, it may not be fantasy, but it'll certainly take some significant action from either a regulatory agency or, maybe we're fantasy again, an act of Congress. And that would be extremely hard to do. In the interim, if you were thinking about for cloud services and people who are worried about resiliency, you folks have been working with space for a while. How would you encourage those who have essential services or important services, but haven't necessarily thought about their cloud services in this national security emergency preparedness mindset? What advice would you give them? Because they haven't had the telecom approach. They've come up on the internet side, which is not the same thing.
Where my mind goes, and I'll defer to Kathryn for her thinking, we have this old phrase called N+1. Most of you are probably familiar with. Every business needs to think about that. N being what you currently have, some object, some service, some whatever. Do you need another one, a plus one? For every one that you have, does there need to be an additional one? Or does there need to be an additional two? These are backups. And should they exist someplace else? So if I have a contracted service with AWS, am I fine with N+0? That's fine. Just all I need is AWS. Or do I need to do a +1 and go over to Google Cloud or someplace else? And I think that's where, to your point, Cristin, for those of us that grew up in telecom and in kind of that older mindset, we're always thinking redundancy, backups, failovers. These are common words that we always are very comfortable with. For those who've grown up in more of an internet world, post, say, Y2K, it's just as a transition point, where everything's diverse, it's not really so much a thing like a central office that I can point to and say, my telephone is connected to that building. Today, my computer, I could follow wires and things, but I really can't say it's connected to that building. It's just connected to the internet. And that's a very different mindset. Maybe there are some older lessons we can pull from that more physical world into the virtual world, maybe different terms, but the concepts are still there, particularly for resiliency, the ability to survive something bad and continue right on working on the other side of it.
I do know that notwithstanding 60 plus years of working on this sort of thing, not only within the sector, but with other sectors, the first step, diversity, from my operation to something, there's still not a lot of N+1. But what I do see is that as you're working with people who are very, very focused on sort of the resiliency of their operations so they can continue to do whatever they need to do, what I see is a growth from N+1, that first step out to the world, to N+1, +1, where they are starting to build the tree. I have two ways of getting out of the building, so I avoid a car blowing up an AT&T building in Atlanta, and I've got another connection to something in another town. From that next step, or people that you rely on, I use two major vendors, and they can be interfungible. This kind of sense of diversity, at least path, ends up building a more resilient environment, because ultimately, whatever your mission is, you know that not everything is important within your organization, but for the top 30% that absolutely have to be in there, I've got diversity at different layers along the path to be able to accommodate it. This is a new way of thinking. It is one that is drawn, in essence, from the internet environment. And as we've become an environment where you rely on so many people for so different many things, and you don't just buy your milk from the guy at the farm down the street, you need to be able to unpack that supply chain and make sure that for the most important things in your operation, you have built in sufficient diversity and ability to sort of preserve that service under pretty much any kind of service. And each company will have a different manifestation of what that'll look like.
Well, with that, I think we have the opportunity to encourage one of our listeners to go create the AI-based tool that will help our listeners to go crawl their data, crawl their cloud tenants, and go figure out which one of those tenants are the most essential, the loss of which would have a serious and detrimental effect to national security and emergency preparedness. Because I think you're right. At some point, we will feel the effects of this. Cloud will need to have some sort of a system. We're not there yet, but we got to start thinking about it. So thank you for listening to Advancing Cyber. We hope you've enjoyed the discussion, and we've advanced cyber along the way. I want to thank Marcus Sachs and Kathryn Condello and our Advancing Cyber team with management support from DC Cyber, our sound engineer and third-year law student Tanner Wilburn, and our undergraduate research interns Layla Moeller and Carolina Oxenstierner. You can share ideas and recommendations via email at cyber@advancingcyber.com. Security is a community, and we always look forward to hearing from you. This is your host, Cristin Flynn Goodwin, saying thank you, patch your devices, and please turn on MFA.